Welcome. My name's John Mathers. I'm an active supporter of SRAG and RCAT, both of which I'll explain in a moment. It's a pleasure to be with you. We have a great speaker today, Professor Robert Verchick. But before I introduce Rob, let me share a few Zoom protocols and a bit about our speakers program. Please, everyone, remain muted during the presentation. The presentation will be recorded, and if you have a question, put it into the chat. And at the end, I'm going to ask for a poll of how you think this went, as we're doing this once a month. Okay. If you don't know about SRAG, SRAG is the Environmental Sustainability Rotary Action Group, which purpose is to assist Rotary clubs, districts, and multi-districts in planning, implementing, and evaluating service projects, building awareness, and inspiring action. The RCAT network supports the creation of Rotary climate action teams at the club level through education and organization. Working together, we can make a difference in Rotary as well as beyond. So please, take action. That's the bottom line. Create an action team. Becomes an individual member of SRAG, $30 a year. Join the RCAT network as an action team. Membership is a $100 donation. And access your our regular program speakers and connection to other clubs, and share your projects. And take advantage of our speakers to inform you or your club on climate change issues and solutions. We have a group of experienced presenters available to you to speak on a variety of subjects, many more than are listed here. And be sure to join us the third Thursday of every month for our Global Speakers Forum. Today, we have Professor Robert Verchick. And Robert is one of the nation's leading scholars in disaster and climate change law. He holds the Gauthier, I hope I got that right, St. Martin Eminent Scholar Chair in the Environmental Law at Loyola University. He's Senior Fellow in Disaster Resilience at Tulane University and President of the Center for Progressive Reform. He's a prolific writer at 60 articles and 4 books, including the award-winning Facing Catastrophe, Environmental Action in a Post-Katrina World. Professor Verchick served in the Obama administration as Deputy Associate Administrator for Policy at the EPA, helping develop climate change adaptation policy while serving on President Obama's Interagency Climate Change Adaptation Task Force. So please help introduce our speaker today, Robert Verchick. And I'm going to stop sharing. And Robert, it's up to you.
Well, thanks so much, John. And I hope everybody can hear me okay. I've already been communicating a little bit on chat for people. I am a fan of Rotary and have been for many, many years. I have many Rotarians in my life, including my father-in-law, who I think is watching today, and he's been a member for over 40 years. And I am so excited to see the work that you are doing, not just on climate change and environment, but on many frontline, what I call frontline communities who are in this struggle. And so I wanted to help set the stage for economics. Now, I'm not a trained economist. I worked, though, in the Obama administration at the EPA, helping to supervise something called the policy office there, which actually includes the large group of economists that work for EPA. And so we did a lot of economic research, and I write a lot about economics and climate. What I want to do, though, is start out by, I'm going to share my screen here. And I want to start out by telling you a story. Okay, all right. So I'm back on, and I wanted to start out by telling you a story, which has to do with this picture here from just south of New Orleans. This is a picture of a place called Island Road, and that road in Terrebonne Parish goes to an island called Ile de Jean Charles. This area is the fastest sinking land on the planet. As you can see here, it's close to the water. You can fish from your driver's seat window, all right? And people do it. I've seen it, okay? This road goes to an island called Ile de Jean Charles, and that's what it looks like. I took this photo from a plane, actually, a few years ago, and you can kind of see on there. Now, there are only about 40 households that live on this island anymore, mainly tribal members of the Ile de Jean Charles band of the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw. And I want to show you a picture of somebody that I work with and who's come and talked to my classes. This is Chantal Cormidel, and that's her daughter there. She lives on Ile de Jean Charles, and she's a member of the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw tribe. And she and many others have been very active in trying to find ways for their people to survive on this island, which they've lived on for generations and generations. They want to rebuild, acquire land as a community and move somewhere else, but it's going to cost over $40 million. All right. And there are lots of communities like this, many of them tribal, many of them poor, living in areas where they're going to have to move. Now, I just want you to take a good look at Chantal and her daughter, because they are the faces of climate change. And I want you to think about that $40 million that her community needs to move and multiply that by a huge other number of all the other Americans, right, in the United States who are going to lose something to climate change. And if you total it all up, I'm going to give you the message right here in the beginning. If you total it all up, climate change in the United States costs $520 billion a year. That's the cost of doing nothing every single year. Now, I'm going to get back to that number, explain how we got it, but I just want to keep that in mind. $500 billion every year. Now, what I'm going to do is I want to talk a little bit about the impacts of climate. I know you probably know something about this if you've been following this this video series. I'm going to talk about the cost because this is about economics. I'm going to make the case that there's a real persuasive economic case for climate action. I'm going to talk about the opportunities, particularly things that we should be doing in the United States. And I promise to talk a little bit about Biden world, because we've been getting a lot of news about the team that Biden is putting together. And a lot of that is going to affect the economics of this country. When I was at the EPA, I mean, one of the things I woke up every morning, honestly, thinking we affect the economy at the EPA. I mean, we made decisions that saved and cost tens of billions of dollars. And so you have to get it right. And so that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. Now, if you know something about climate change, you know we're in what I call a no analog future. The past isn't going to suggest what the future of our climate's going to look like, or what the future expenses or benefits are going to look like. So that bottom line, that analog line, is what natural climate change would look like. That top line is what our climate change actually does look like, all right, either observed or projected. And so the point here is that it's hard, right, to figure out economic numbers when we don't know what the future holds. And that's one of the big issues that we have in this area. Now, just to give you a little bit of context, climate change is going to make the world hotter, wetter, drier, and weirder. All right. We have lots and lots of data on this. This is data that came from the National Climate Assessment, a body of several federal agencies. This came out in the Trump administration. But it's real science, right? I mean, at least these particular assessments were released ahead of time, leaked actually to the New York Times, and and then eventually corroborated. But here it's rising temperatures, and you can see in these hot scenarios down here in the lower right, how warm things are going to get. So when you think about that, think about drying soil, right? So think about agriculture, and think about heat waves, which is the major cause of death in the world if we're looking at natural disasters. Heavy precipitation, look at this. This is observed numbers, right, in the top part of your screen. 55% difference in change in precipitation in the Northeast. So think there about all the kinds of flooding, right, that might occur. Think about traffic snarls. Think about people not being able to get to the hospital, all right? And think about people losing their homes, right, on the coast, or losing their property value, or not being able to afford insurance. Sea level rise is something, of course, we think a lot about. Current numbers are really hard to understand, but maybe by the end of the century, we're looking at up to 6-9 feet of sea level rise. Maybe not necessarily, but it's in the offing. And these cyclonic storms. I mean, I'm talking to you from New Orleans, and we have had more storms in this year than almost ever before, and the highest and a direct hit of a category storm coming directly over us. That's just going to increase the number of intense storms. All right. Now, here we're going to talk a little bit about the economics. And so I'm going to show you the first slide here, where what I want you to look at, these are projected scenarios of how much carbon we'll have in the atmosphere, depending on how we get our act together as a world, essentially, right, in regulating. So you can see down at the very bottom, that 1.5 pathway, 2 degrees centigrade pathway. Those are pathways that the so-called Paris Agreement is bargaining for, right? That's where people are trying to get, all right? And the idea behind 2 degrees centigrade or Celsius is that is thought by scientists to be the trigger point. In other words, if we get hotter than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, it's thought that we will not be able to avoid large catastrophic risk in the world. And so that's why it's so important to stay below there. Now, if you're reading ahead, right, what you could already see is the pledges under the Paris Agreement don't keep us there. They get us as far up as 3.2 Celsius. And current policies today, if they were just to continue, would get us to 3.1 or 3.7, which is way too high. Now, I just want you to think about that 3.1 to 3.7 number. Hold it in your head, and I'm going to show you this next slide. This is the most complicated slide I think I'm going to show you. But if you see here in the temperatures at the bottom, between 3 and 4 degrees, this is a measure of the global damage at 3 to 4 degrees. And it could be anywhere in that shaded area, right? And on the left hand, on the y-axis there is the percentage of GDP of the United States that's at risk when you're at 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. Now, this probably doesn't say much to you yet, all right? These scientists at Stanford and Brookings who figured this out. But here's the last piece. That number right there, which is a little over 3%, is our recent annual economic growth in the United States, right? The economy expands by around 3%. So what this means is if we let temperatures get up this high, climate change every year gobbles up all economic growth in the United States. Everything you work for, everything I work for, everything everybody works for in the United States to create value is eaten up by climate change. There's nothing left. All right. That's one of the most persuasive arguments to do something about this. Our economy cannot expand if we don't get climate change under control. Now, why this is so is worth taking a look at. And I just want to sort of walk through just a few things that you can see. The agricultural sector, not the largest sector of the economy in the United States, but certainly the most vulnerable. There are at least a dozen states in the Midwest that rely on agriculture. And extreme rainfalls have increased about 37% in the Midwest. And that has produced huge flooding. And it's an abnormal snow melts and things like this. Many fields just this year have washed away. Livestock has drowned. Nebraska lost $440 million worth of cattle this year. Iowa suffered $1.6 billion in losses just for the year because of flooding that scientists relate to the climate change that we are experiencing. Now, infrastructure is another big story. Sea level rise is threatening a lot of our infrastructure. We probably have $2 to $5 trillion worth of assets on the coast that are in danger of being flooded by rising seas related to climate change. I'm down here in the Gulf, and we estimate down here that we have between $1 and $2 trillion worth of assets at risk to climate change. And a lot of those assets are factories and refineries and petroleum product plants and housing developments and you name it, right? So it's housing and airports and docks and railway lines. When I was at the EPA, the Department of Interior did a huge inventory just of the roads and bridges and railway lines around the United States. What you're seeing here is a naval base, right? This is Norfolk, the largest naval complex in the entire world, military naval complex. And they are taking this extremely serious. They're about at 10 feet above sea level. And if sea level gets, up to 11 feet, which it could in this particular area, relative sea level rise, they could be underwater. We now have estimates from the federal government showing that by 2050, military bases all along the East and the Gulf coasts could be 3 months a year underwater, right? And it's not enough just to fix the bases. You got to fix the communities that serve the bases, right? All the people who live in those areas. So runways, roads, infrastructure, equipment, this kind of thing. There's a lot of public health and productivity risk here. I mentioned the heat waves and heat stress. If temperatures go up 4.5 Celsius, which is on the high side from what I told you, we expect, and we, by meaning the federal government, expects 9,300 people to die in American cities because of heat stress. In 2000, I think it was 2003, 2004, there was the large heat wave that occurred in Europe and France during the summer. France and then most dramatically, but other countries in Europe. 70,000 people died that summer because of heat stress. The largest group were elderly people and particularly elderly women. The losses associated with extreme temperature death just by itself in the United States is about $140 billion. On top of that, you've got what the doctors call vector-borne illness, right? Which is going to be moving into areas, dengue fever, West Nile, Zika, extreme weather and climate-related natural disasters will relate to public health too. And we're talking mental health issues as well as many other things. This slide also tells you, this slide also tells you about productivity. And that's a huge issue too. Temperature extremes are projected to cost us about 2 billion labor hours every year by 2090. And that's $160 billion worth of lost wages. In fact, lost productivity is seen as being the largest economic cost related to climate change. And so think about that GDP, right? All of those things again. There's also a loss of investment, and this is these are narrow lines to look at. This is oil, right? And the oil's been down, oil consumption's been down, as you may know, because of COVID, but also because of of the influx of cheaper green technology. Solar is probably right now one of the cheapest sources of electricity, certainly in the United States right now, if there were enough of it. But my point here is that oil demand is not going up significantly in the long term. And you've got all of these oil and gas companies that have significant investments. You may have significant investments in oil and gas companies, either directly or through your 501ks or what have you. And that's going to be a problem. I mean, the coal industry lost tens of billions of dollars in the last few years. And so, getting out of that is going to be troubling. Now, the good news is that there are other ways of making money too. Now, if you take all of this together, it gets you to this report that I started with, that gave you that $500 billion number. These are two scientists at EPA, and they looked at 22 different sectors essentially and said, okay, what is this going to do, climate change? And what they found, and you can see here, hundreds of billions of dollars a year. That's where they get the $500 billion number. The key, though, is that lowering emissions and adapting would result in substantial economic benefits. And so they pull out that $520 billion a year number. But what they say is that it doesn't have to be that number. It could be about half of that if we were to adopt good climate action. And that's what I want to talk about next, right? Is that there are these huge opportunities. This is the only functioning offshore wind farm in the United States. You may know there are many in the North Sea in Europe. And recent surveys of the top global businesses in the United States suggest that there are over $2 trillion in new business prospects like this. Now, I gave you this picture because I love this. This is deep water. This supplies electricity to Connecticut. It's off the shore of Rhode Island. It's a series of these wind farms in deep water. What I want to brag about is that the decks, the legs, and the boat that you see out there building this thing, everything was designed and manufactured in my backyard in New Orleans, either in Houma, in New Orleans, or elsewhere in southern Louisiana. This is the irony of the thing, right? We have no wind technology developed in Louisiana. We have no offshore wind. We have a lot of offshore wind. We don't have offshore wind farms in Louisiana. But because we've been building oil platforms for over almost 100 years out here, we know this technology. We build this stuff in the North Sea, but we don't build it in our own backyard. And that's a bottleneck. So there are lots of opportunities. Some of these opportunities are related to reducing carbon from the atmosphere, things like what those windmills do. And for instance, we did a lot of this trying to get to our commitments under Paris. And I just want to say something about the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement, part of it's enforceable, most of it isn't. To say that the Paris Agreement costs the United States or any country any money at all is not right, is incorrect, because in fact, the Paris Agreement doesn't require anyone really to do anything in terms of reducing emissions. What it does do is it asks for commitments for countries to make, and the United States did make a commitment. And under the Obama administration, there were several types of regulations that went into effect in order to get us down to the Paris commitment that we had made. Part of that was controlling carbon from power plants. Part of that, you can see down here, was fuel economy standards on cars, limiting methane leaks, more efficient appliances. California itself had its own state laws that were a big wedge of getting down to the Paris numbers. The point, a lot of this actually has been rescinded, right, in the Trump administration. But the point that I want to make is that's unfortunate for a number of reasons. The power plant standards alone according to the federal government numbers, would have netted us $45 billion. That's net, the net benefit. All right. We left $45 billion on the table when we got rid of those standards. All right. The other thing that we left on the table were 3,600 avoided deaths, in part because keeping carbon out of the air also keeps other things out of the air like soot. And soot is a real killer in the United States. Our regulation of soot over the last 30 years, according to the EPA, over the last 30 years, our regulation of soot has saved 4 million lives, right? That's not an exaggeration. These are the premature deaths, right? But that's a lot of people. And if you want to think like an economist, it's a lot of money and productivity. The other thing that you find out, these folks are folks actually that also speak to my students. This is an area a little up the river from New Orleans. These are folks whose communities are abut against petrochemical plants. And as you might imagine, they get lots of air pollution. And they actually are very interested in cutting carbon because cutting carbon cuts down on those other pollutants. And what they want you to know, right, is that when I was at the EPA, right, my group of economists worked it out. And actually these numbers are the same under the Bush administration before us. The benefits of all air regulations in the United States are 25 times what it costs industry to comply with. So that's a really important number. I testified before Congress on this issue. And in fact, I was questioned by at least 2 congressmen who said, what do you mean 25 times? That can't be right. And they said, that's because that was the Obama administration. And I said, I have 2 answers. I said, the first answer is the numbers were virtually the same under the George W. Bush administration. And incidentally, they're virtually the same under the Trump administration too, if you find them. The second answer I had is, how do you fudge 25 times? I mean, a factor of 25 is not a rounding error, right? And so there's something going on. There are winners and losers. There are people who are going to lose some money, and there are more people who are going to win. But that doesn't mean we don't care, right, about the people who are going to lose something. And I'm going to get to that in a minute. I belong to a number of groups. I help lead a group called the Center for Progressive Reform. And we just came out with a giant energy study. And we have a few prescriptions out there. You can check this out if you're interested. And some of these opportunities, which will create economic benefit, are things like enacting a green energy standard. You would have to do this, I think, by an act of Congress to make it right. But you could essentially, many states have this, half of the states have their own green energy standards. We desperately need to update our power grid because it's failing us. In some ways, it's worse. Well, it's just, it's failing in times of storm and flooding, and it can't absorb the energy that we can generate through green power. We turn wind turbines off because there's too much energy going into the grid and the grid can't handle it. So we got to fix that problem. We could do a lot about mass transit just by helping where things are zoned, how things are built. We could phase out dirty energy on federal lands. A lot of the mining of coal and so on takes place on lands that you and I own. Right? We could instead be leasing that out for wind farms or for solar farms or other things like that. And then we need to steer clean energy into Black and brown communities and all communities that are disadvantaged. Because if they can lower the amount of carbon pollution that comes from generating their electricity, they don't go to the emergency room because of asthma anymore, because of those other things that come out. And so those are kind of win-wins, if you will, right? It's kind of distributing benefits for everyone. So that's reducing carbon. You can also, the other thing that you have to do is adapt to the changes that you're not going to be able to avoid. And those are substantial. A lot of this is under the heading of infrastructure. And infrastructure, as you know, is something that we need in the United States, that is to update. It creates a lot of jobs, and it provides all kinds of different sorts of benefits. This is infrastructure, $10 billion or so worth of infrastructure that came after Hurricane Katrina to protect New Orleans, which is in the background of this photo. That's the largest set of working pumps in the world. Thank goodness for it, because we've had our share of rain. To stay in my neck of the woods, there's a lot of adjusting to do. After Hurricane Katrina, they raised the I-10 twin span by almost 20 feet because of sea level rise. And they're doing this in other places. In San Francisco, I know the John Mathers is in San Francisco, and the footings of the Oakland Bridge actually were designed in a way that didn't respect sea level rise, and they're already worried about how they're going to protect that. They're using wetlands and other things to do it. But it just goes to show, I mean, even modern infrastructure needs adjustments. And then there is a story of people who are going to have to be moving, and we expect somewhere around 12 million people in the United States will be moving because of flooded coasts, whether that's in Miami or in New Orleans or in Los Angeles or San Francisco and so on. This is another tribal community up in Alaska, which is in sort of the same situation as my friends on Ile de Chancharl. So there are lots of opportunities in this and ways to make money, but it's not all shiny and glossy. And I don't want to escape from that, because that's extremely important for us to understand. Look into the eyes of these people, right? Some of these workers, like the guy on the wind turbine and the gentleman there putting in a solar roof panel, they're winners in this new green economy. And it's going to be on net a lot of winners, but there are going to be people who lose their jobs too. And so how do we deal with that? Here's the rub. Now, this is another study that comes out of Stanford University. I've showed you a few of these because they have centers that are doing incredible work on this. This guy named Mark Jacobson, who went state by state, every single state, and said, what would it take to take this state to zero carbon emissions? What would it take for this state to go, right? Depending on its own energy mix. And he showed that all 50 states could, by 2050, be carbon neutral, be carbon zero, right? And he also showed that it would create 2 million jobs on net in the United States. 2 million more jobs than we have today, all right? But now I'm going to show you some secret. The secret is the way you get to 2 million is by creating 6 million jobs almost, and then 4 million layoffs, right? That's the problem. That's the economic issue. And I think for too long, right, in this debate, we've heard from industry saying, oh, we're going to lose jobs or we're going to lose money. And then, environmentalists like me say, no, we're actually going to make 2 million jobs. But what we don't talk about is that subtraction sign, right? And that's really important, because the people who are going to be subtracted, right? Some of them are well off and powerful and educated and can do all kinds of things. A lot of them aren't. A lot of them don't have college degrees. Many of them are people of color. A lot of them are living on the margins. So here's just a quick example, right? So there's like I said, there was a plan for every state under this particular study. And you can see here that California is a net winner. Sounds great, but it's going to lose a lot of jobs, right? Texas actually is a net loser under this particular study. This is what I think is interesting. Louisiana is a net winner, right? We think of ourselves as an oil and gas state. We would actually add 180,000 jobs if we went totally no carbon. But the problem is we would lose some jobs too. right? And then there are places like Colorado, which are kind of like, you know, on net, they would lose 6,000 jobs. So we've got to figure this one out. And what is hard about it is it requires investments in transition. It requires subsidies in certain areas to move workers into other areas. And it's going to require a lot of growing pains, but it can work. There are, you know, unions in Europe, for instance, in Germany and so on, that have negotiated very interesting packages for these kinds of transitions to work, so that the workers in these industries actually become advocates for climate action. As it turns out, in my neck of the woods, a lot of the offshore oil and gas jobs can be transferred to offshore wind, right? Oil and petroleum industry to wind industry is not an unusual transition in the United States. But there are other transitions that are hard, and some of them are geographically based. And of course, that would require people to move and so on. So it's a big issue. What does this mean for you folks, right? Who are all over the world doing amazing things, including, incidentally, right, working on environmental sustainability and working on climate change and working in your own communities. I don't know enough, right, about everything that you do, but what I do know is that the things you're interested in, whether it's public health or whether it's the economic vibrancy of small communities in urban areas and in rural areas, and that you're interested in people all over the world. I know you're interested in climate change because of that, because all of those things are affected, right? And so if I were, you know, just thinking, I'm taking this from your website, right, about what could groups like yours do, particularly groups with such an international reach and with such expertise in so many areas. Some things I think that are really important, particularly in the United States, are helping to build clean and affordable energy in vulnerable communities, because we don't want them to get left out. We don't want what some people call energy gentrification, right? Where it's the people with the big homes who have the solar panels and get the tax credits and are making their own energy cheaply for their house. And then it's people living in apartment buildings in less desirable neighborhoods that are still, you know, consuming electricity based on coal and then breathing in all the smoke because of it. What we need are ways to build smaller generating capacity. And we can do it. I mean, it's being done actually here in Louisiana and other places too, to bring clean, affordable energy to vulnerable communities, to help vulnerable communities thrive, become more organized, safer, and more resilient. People like Chantal that I told you about, who are in areas prone to flood and so on. There's a lot of work, as I said, to be done about helping workers make the transition to the green economy, because they're not going to be in favor of it if it means losing their jobs, right? And you wouldn't be either. And encouraging businesses and investors to disclose their climate liabilities and to favor activities that are clean and resilient and beneficial to everybody. This takes us back to the everybody, right? To people like Chantal and her daughter, who live on an island that you may not have even known existed, and learning about stories. Now, if you were to talk to Chantal 10 years ago, she would have told you she had all kinds of issues in her community, but she wouldn't necessarily have linked them to climate change. And I think that you must be working in communities all over the world that you may not connect to climate change. But one of the things you could do in anything that you're working on at Rotary is to say, how would climate change make it harder for these people to thrive that I'm helping or working with? What would make it harder? More flooding, more heat waves, more asthma because of heat inversions and pollution, vector-borne illness. What is it that climate change could do to derail some of the progress I'm trying to make? And then you could try to figure out how to minimize that. So I promised you a take on Biden world just at the end. And what I'm going to do now is unshare my screen. And I'm just going to give you a quick rundown about Biden world, and then you can ask me, questions. I don't have a lot of inside knowledge. What I can tell you is something you may already know, is that Gina McCarthy, actually someone that I worked with when I was at EPA, she has been tapped to be the senior advisor on climate change for domestic issues by Biden. That's an extremely important position because she is going to be in charge of essentially coordinating all of the heads of the agencies on climate. She was very, very good at getting the trust of industry, even though, as you might imagine, they weren't in favor of many of the things that she did. She was the brains behind the limits that were placed on power plants, the so-called Clean Power Plan, and she was the initiator of the fuel economy standards under the Obama administration. So those things have all been relaxed and pushed back in the Trump administration, and she knows how to reactivate it. So I think that that's a sign there. John Kerry, as you know, is her foreign policy parallel. He's going to be advising the president on foreign policy. And that makes me think that the Paris Agreement is going to be very top of the heap again, because he was very interested, John Kerry was, in development of the Paris Agreement when it was being negotiated with Obama. Jennifer Granholm, former governor of Michigan, is going to lead the Department of Energy if she's confirmed. I went to law school with her. We worked together on projects, and I'm so glad to see her doing this. She knows everything about transportation. She's in Michigan, and helped with the rollout of the automobile bailouts under the Obama administration. And so I suspect that transportation is going to be a really important issue. Pete Buttigieg is going to head, if he's confirmed, the Department of Transportation, and that makes me think that the Department of Transportation is going to be very interested in climate. And one of the things I like about Pete Buttigieg is, as you know, he's a former mayor, which makes me think he's going to care about local government, about zoning, building codes, parking lots, all of these snoozy little issues that actually make huge differences if you can bring them to scale. So I think that's interesting. I just wrote a blog post yesterday about a woman named Brenda Mallory, who's going to be heading the CEQ, the Council of Environmental Quality. That's the council that is in charge, among other things, of orchestrating environmental justice through the federal agencies. And it's also in charge of all those environmental impact statements you read about. What's interesting about the environmental impact statements is that you can use them to inventory climate impacts. And the Trump administration just got through sort of undoing all of that work, making sure that environmental impact statements couldn't be used for climate change purposes. But I think Brenda Mallory is going to, I would assume, is going to try to bring all of that back and do it with a focus on environmental justice, because her current work right now is at the Southern Environmental Law Center, which is an EJ group. So I will stop there. Well, let me just say one other thing. I think it's going to be hard for a Biden administration to do anything remarkable about climate if it doesn't have control of the Senate. There are two barriers. If it doesn't have control of the Senate, and we have a much more conservative Supreme Court than we did years back. Both of those things are going to be hard either to pass or to defend what I would call sort of innovative, large federal climate change action programs. But what I would expect Biden to do, using his executive power, is to try to roll back a lot of the losses that we had in the Trump administration on climate. And I would suspect to move again on tighter fuel economy standards, tighter standards on electric plants, and a sleeper issue, but a huge issue, changing securities regulation so that companies are required to more specifically disclose their climate liabilities. That could be a game changer in domestic investment and in global investment. So I will stop there. And if there are questions, I am happy to answer them and go anywhere you want.